Hello and welcome to the Cyber Weekly. The Cyber Weekly is a podcast which talks about cybersecurity, and today we have Nathan Sweaney. Nathan has been in the industry for 2 decades now and is running still on fumes. I'm not sure if it's on fumes or is still steady, but yes, welcome Nathan to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yes.
And the fumes thing is probably, I think we all run on fumes at times, for sure.
Depends on how tight your boss is on that occasion.
There's that. Yeah. How well you deal with stress and anxiety.
Yeah. So, first of all, welcome to the show. How did you you've been in the industry for quite some time. If you had to dig deep into how you started in cybersecurity, we start from there.
Yeah, sure. So I got into cybersecurity, honestly, in the 90s as a kid. I started doing some questionable stuff, never quite broke the law, but, skeetered around it a little bit. And then, moving into the early 2000s, I went to school. Back then, we didn't have degrees in cybersecurity, but I got a computer science degree and was really interested in security. We didn't call it cyber back then. It was just, InfoSec or information security. But really, my first job out of college, I was working for a point of sale company. And that's when the PCI credit card requirements first kind of became a thing. Talking 2004, 2005 timeframe. So I really got started with that compliance side of credit card security. And then after a few years, we were providing more and more services around that, trying to help small businesses become secure and, dealing with compliance and all that. Started doing more penetration testing and really got into, kind of found my passion. I was, a younger man, probably in my mid-20s, late 20s at that point. So just kind of chased that. Around 2013, I went to work. A friend of mine was starting up a company, Secure Ideas, and had a couple of consultants, and I joined on. And then, we kind of built that up I was there for about 12 years. Saw kind of a wide range of things. Did a lot of security assessments. Penetration testing was kind of our bread and butter. But we were doing a lot of strategic guidance and, now what might be called vCISO or fractional CISO. We were doing that type of, consulting work a little bit. But so that's kind of my path. And then I left there about a year and a half ago. And currently I'm at the University of Tulsa. I'm in a research institute called the Oklahoma Cyber Innovation Institute. And we're community focused, just trying to improve cybersecurity in education, small businesses, and the drone and UAS industry. That's uncrewed aerial systems. So kind of a wide range of stuff, but it's all focused around cybersecurity types of work.
Yeah, that is interesting. First of all, actually, Tulsa is known for drone innovation. So that's quite a good place to be in the Silicon Valley of drones. Yeah. If you compare pen tests 10 years ago compared to now, what's the big difference? Is it harder to break into systems now, or there are new holes which we didn't expect as currently open?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely harder than it was. If you go back 10 or 15 years ago, there were so many flaws and vulnerabilities. You could easily, pivot into stuff and take advantage of fairly trivial flaws without a lot of effort. I think what we're seeing is the defensive tools have gotten better. The offensive tools have gotten better too, but really it's gotten more nuanced and complex. That doesn't mean that you can't just break into stuff now easily. I think you're getting more and more organizations who are finally starting to take security seriously. And so they're just stepping into maybe their first pen test. Those, everybody's first time sucks. You get beat up, you get your bloody nose, it's you had no idea. You thought you were pretty secure, and then the pen testers come and, give you a run for it. But at the same time, I think the majority of organizations who have been doing security for 10 years or so, they're much more mature. And so it's harder to find the same types of flaws that you can pivot and move around with, whatnot. I think that partly goes back to what is the point of pen testing though? Used to, we could just say, hey, we're just going to hire somebody to come in here and see if they can get in and see what they can do. I think over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a migration from pen testing being almost more of a black box effort to being more, hey, we want to assess our security controls. If we've spent so much money on security, we want to see how well does this stuff actually work? Does it do what we think it's doing? And, where are the gaps? So pen testing is becoming more collaborative. There's a lot more, some people call it purple team or assumed breach, but I think it's really more around let's assess the controls we've got in place and see how well they really work. I don't know. That was a long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, but if to some point What about misconfigurations? Because I feel like nowadays the systems are strong, but they don't factor in the basis that we are still human beings and we don't always follow the rule book or guidelines of actually
For sure.
how to use the technologies we are having in our networks.
Well, yeah, for sure. Like every organization has technologies that they just, they quickly bought, they deployed, they ran with it. The default is good enough. There's some controls around that are getting better. People are starting to say, hey, this is important. Let's change the defaults and make sure we actually do what we're supposed to be doing. One of the challenges there is, commodity hardware. People see a thing and they're like, ooh, that's neat. Let me go buy that off Amazon and deploy it on my network without really understanding how it works.
Could you break down what the commodity hardware is actually?
Yeah, so commodity hardware, I'm just talking about like consumer-based stuff, cheap stuff. Think about like when
IoT.
IoT devices, absolutely, cheap cameras, or you've got the light bulbs that you can control from your computer, stuff like that. Anytime there's some new thing that everybody's like, hey, this is cool, you can go buy it on AliExpress or Amazon, or you get it as a giveaway at some conference, and people just deploy it on their network without really thinking about it. And so
Should
those are
we
not
also
really built with
consider
security. What's
should
that?
you also consider open cloud as as one of those things?
For sure. Yeah. Everybody sees, hey, here's this thing. I want to do this thing in the cloud. And they just buy a license or maybe use a free version without really understanding what are you giving away? What access does this have to your environment? With that said, again, a lot of organizations are starting to deploy more standards. They have configuration standards. They have more mature auditing and governance. They have a process to assess vendors and, third-party management. So we're kind of seeing we're in this place in the industry where there's still a lot of folks that need a lot of help, and yet there's also some really mature organizations that are paying attention to this stuff.
So on to the next question. A lot of companies treat pen testing as a checkbox most of the times that, compliance requires this and we've finished that. So they get to reports and they fix the highs and ignore the rest. With your experience, how do you convince a client that actually this slow vulnerability today could be the start of a massive breach tomorrow?
So I don't know that I do. And let me explain that a little bit. There are always going to be low risk vulnerabilities. If I park my car in a sketchy area where I know there's a lot of crime, that's a risk. But I may have a reason that I have to be there, right? Like it may be I'm only parking there during certain times, or I have an event that I have to go to and that's the only parking lot available. It may be that I've added additional controls. Maybe I have a dash cam that's monitoring or whatever. So I think when it comes to risk management, we have to think about the actual business case of why that risk is there. And sometimes it's worth it to just accept it. And, I think cybersecurity folks often fall into the trap of saying, here's a bad thing. You can't do this. You're not allowed to do this thing because there's risk associated with it. And in reality, if we stopped all risk, if we stopped all low risk findings and prevented them, what we would end up doing is building an organization that can't compete in the business world. Right? We would be hindering the ability to be innovative and to move quickly. And so I think there's a balance there. As cybersecurity professionals, it's our job to identify risks and to say, hey, here's something that the organization needs to be aware of. But it's also our job to say, here are some mitigating factors and here are some, potentially optional remediations. So maybe we just accept this risk, but we take that into consideration for other things, So I guess I would push back on the question a little bit. I don't know that we need to convince them that every low needs to be fixed. There are some lows that absolutely could be combined with other vulnerabilities and become a huge deal, but there's a lot of lows that aren't that big a deal. So that's kind of the way I approach it. But I guess getting back to the crutch of your question, how would I approach an organization and convince them that any particular risk needs to be taken into consideration? I always try to pull that back into the actual value to the organization. What's going to cost the organization money? What is going to prevent them from operating their business? Anything like that. If I can show them that this particular risk is going to prevent them from staying in business, now they look at it and they say, okay, that's real. Like, here's an example. If I'm working on a penetration test and I find a vulnerability that gives me domain admin into, their domain controller or whatever. I'm not going to necessarily tell them in the executive summary, hey, this flaw gave me domain admin. What I'm going to tell them is this flaw gave me access to your email, which allowed me to find out details about this upcoming merger that could cost you $3 million. Right? Like that puts it in practical terms that any non-technical executive can look at and say, oh, that's really bad. I need to fix that. Whereas if I tell them something technical, like I got domain admin via this API, whatever vulnerability, they don't know what that means and they don't care. So they can't really calculate it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really makes sense. In fact, I feel like you should dig deep into that, give more examples, because I feel like that's like a big challenge in our industry. So you find that as the IT guys are all excited about how you are able to actually do it, but you're not quantifying it to the level that someone from the decision-making part is able to actually understand that this is actually something key and we need to actually resolve this.
Yeah. Well, here's another real world example. So I was in an organization one time and I found a vulnerability that was on the network. Anybody on the network could exploit it. And it was a series of unpatched servers that had very significant access. If you exploited this flaw, you could very easily get, root access. Well, not root access. It was, local admin access on these servers. They were Windows servers. I thought, hey, this is awesome. This is huge. We exploited one, got into it and started poking around and pretty quickly figured out it wasn't on the network domain. It was on an isolated network. There was no access to anything except for this one device, and we couldn't figure out what the device was. And so we reached out to our contact and started exploring, and come to find out it was basically the water filters for the water fountains. There wasn't much we could do. Worst case, we could disable that and the water filtration system wouldn't work on the water fountains. This wasn't an area where the water is like dangerous and if it's not filtered, you're going to be in trouble. It was just a like, hey, that filter is not going to work the way it's intended to do. And, I don't even remember what the automation does, but it was very low risk. It didn't really matter. That's an example of like, hey, this is a really significant flaw by itself outside of context. But when you add the actual context, the business doesn't care. The other issue there was, kind of a mitigating factor is it was in an old building that they were currently trying to sell. And so they didn't want to dump any more money into it because in 6 months they weren't going to be there anyway. So, you know what I mean? You, as cybersecurity people, we have to consider all of the pieces of information, all of the context around it. And sometimes, unfortunately, we don't have that. Sometimes it's our job to provide the details we do have and let the business make the decision. I apologize. I think a truck just pulled past me. Hopefully that wasn't too loud. But anyway, that's kind of my perspective on that type of thing.
Yeah, that's really something which I'm definitely considering to add. Hopefully my raise will be will be there after bringing out information like that.
Yeah, I will tell you, as folks are getting into cybersecurity and are early in their career, if you can demonstrate that you understand how business works and that you understand risk management and more than just, hey, I'm a junior pen tester or I'm a SOC analyst or whatever, if you can demonstrate, here's how my role impacts the risk to the organization, that has a huge impact on, getting promotions and raises and that sort of thing, because that's really hard to teach.
Yeah, that's very true. So you mentioned, first of all, in Tulsa, which is the drone hub per se. So most people worry about their laptops getting hacked. What happens when we start talking about hacking autonomous vehicles flying over our heads, and what are the unique challenges of securing a drone supply chain?
Yeah, so most people don't realize this. They don't, even in the US, they don't think about Tulsa as drone headquarters. But for whatever reason, there's been over $100 million in the last 3 years invested in the Tulsa area around drone manufacturing. So we've got a lot of drone manufacturers, even international companies are moving to Tulsa because they want to be in the middle of what's going on. And so we're kind of helping build some infrastructure and some stuff around that. Some of the challenges there, is we have these devices that are fairly low powered already, and all of the additional power that basically any additional processing that happens on the device requires power. That means the device can't fly as long as it could before. And so if we start inserting a bunch of controls and encryption and stuff like that that takes power resources, that is a direct hindrance to the operations of the device, which business doesn't like. If I fly a drone for my business and I can fly it for 2 hours, but now I add these security controls and I take off 10%, 15% of the flight time, that's a huge risk to the organization. Right? There's a direct cost associated with that. So that's one side of it is we just have limitations there. Another side, you mentioned, if we can compromise drones in flight, there's a lot of different ways to do that, either through RF attacks or, trying to intercept man in the middle of the traffic, or potentially using other drones to do. There's been a lot of different examples and ways that can happen. Obviously, the risks, it depends on what it's being used for. So here, one of the things that's happening is, the local police department and the fire department, they use drones for first response. And so we had a situation about a year ago where the fire department was using a drone to monitor a large commercial fire. It was in, I don't remember, some type of I think it was a manufacturing organization or something. But there was a huge tank that had some kind of chemical in it, and it was getting really hot, and it eventually did explode. Fortunately, the drone overhead was able to monitor the temperature, all that the drone was getting ready to explode, and it was able to relay information to the firefighters, hey, you need to move out of this area before it explodes. It ended up saving several lives. But if an attacker was able to manipulate or take down that drone in flight, right, there's an obvious connection to, loss of life there. Some other things, drones are being used for hospital deliveries to be able to take vaccines and actually blood supplies and stuff like that to more remote areas. And so the ability to compromise or take down one of those systems is a lot more, it's a bigger issue than just, hey, you stole my Amazon package, right? Obviously, we care about that too.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? We're talking potentially life and death stuff. And then there's the issue if I can cause this uncrewed aerial system to somehow interfere with commercial traffic, like actual flights, that's a much bigger issue because now I'm talking potential causing planes or helicopters to crash and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of potential areas of concern there. I think you mentioned you asked about some of the unique security challenges. One of the biggest problems is just this whole industry is growing so quickly, and there's so much competition to get into the market as quickly as possible, to build a product and to sell it and to compete. And cybersecurity is slow. It takes time to do security architecture reviews and penetration tests and to really consider all of the stuff. And when there's a strong economic incentive to move fast, sometimes security gets set aside. So that's a big challenge. We also have a huge ton of devices that are super cheap that you can get out of China that maybe don't have the same security controls implemented, but it's hard to tell. And so we just don't have the governance maturity around that technology. And that's some of what we're working on to try to improve that.
Yeah, definitely. It's something interesting. Speaking of, you talked of the sending of blood using the drones. Not far from me, different country, but within East Africa. I'm in Uganda, but in Rwanda, they actually use drones to move blood from one area to the other. So yes, there's definitely a lot of use cases for it, and the fact that it makes life easier and also hard to reach areas, easily gotten for such information. I mean, for such cases is actually key. But obviously, we can't say that. Anyway, I think that when government comes in to put in some bit of tightening around the ropes, that will help with that situation.
Potentially, I think another challenge here, and similar with AI and other technologies, is the technologies are developing so quickly that it's really hard for government to put regulations in place to control it. And so that's a challenge. As soon as, by the time government builds the regulatory model that they need to say, here's how this should be handled, the technology is already developed past that, where it's no longer relevant. So I think there's opportunity for industry to step in. That's partly what we're seeing in the US is the local industry is saying, hey, we have to solve this problem ourselves. We can't wait for the government to do it. So I don't know. We'll see how the future goes. I think there's a balance there that needs to happen, but there definitely needs to be more people thinking about it.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is more of like the way that the CIDSS came up for payment cards. I think they will have to do something like that.
Very similar, yeah. And actually,
Yeah.
that's a great example because PCI is not a government regulation. The credit card brands, primarily the U.S. based brands, decided, hey, we want to fix this problem before the government regulates us, and so they put the infrastructure in place to do that. That's a good point.
Yeah. So you're working to inject cybersecurity into the drones industry from the beginning. That's rare. Usually building tech and securing it. What does secure by design actually look like for a drone manufacturer if you're looking at it on that basis?
Yeah, yeah. So I think part of it is understanding security architecture, security design, understanding. When I was in college, we had learned a system design lifecycle, or some people call it a software development lifecycle, right? Depending on your industry.
SDLC.
Yeah, right. And so we learned there's different types of SDLCs and different models, but we learned a process of going through, requirements determination and internal design, external design, all this stuff. At no point back then, this was early 2000s, no point did we ever talk about security. And so what we've seen over the next 20 years is an effort to say we need to integrate security. We talk about it being further to the left, right? We need to integrate security at the different design levels, even to the point of saying what are the security requirements up front. And so
Yes.
I think that's one of the challenges with any technology, but particularly with drones. We have to introduce and educate the manufacturers to the importance of security and how to do that. What does it mean to consider cybersecurity concerns as part of the requirements determination phase? Or if you're using an agile development model, we talk about, okay, what is our initial MVP, the minimum viable product?
Product, yeah.
Exactly, right? So what are the minimum security requirements that have to go in this version? And then every iteration, we have to say, what are the security requirements that needed to be added? Are we too much? Are we not enough? And that's a hard balance. The challenge there, going back to developing tech, is most of these companies are built by people who have an idea and they know how to make things. And so they say, okay, let me start building this thing and let me get it out to market. It's hard to say, let's go pay for a security person who's not going to make us any money and pay them to sit on staff and slow us down. Right. And so that's what we're looking at, is saying, okay, how can we help educate people, but also how can we define a minimum set of standards and requirements so that everybody can say, okay, I at least have to do X, Y, and Z. And then also building in sort of the governance oversight, some assessment processes, so that if companies want to do it the right way, they can engage with us and we can come help do an assessment to make sure they're actually, fitting this in.
Yeah, it sounds like you are trying to talk about one key area, which is having the DevSecOps kind of doing work.
Yeah,
which I
yeah,
believe
absolutely.
with that, most of those problems will be solved.
Yeah, I don't know if they'll be solved, but it's definitely getting better.
At least you're skeptical in the right ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we are drawing towards the end, as a pen tester, you're seeing AI change the offensive side of actually cybersecurity. Our tooling is actually getting smarter at finding vulnerabilities automatically, making the human element no longer useful.
Yes and no. AI means a lot of different things. And a lot of people, when they talk about AI, they're just talking about ChatGPT or Gemini or, whatever their LLM of choice is. Those tools are extremely powerful and they are great at augmenting a human. But those tools by themselves are never going to replace that human element. I don't know what's going on behind me. They're moving something big. I apologize. I hope this sounds not horrible. But those tools, like I said, are great force multipliers to augment the capabilities of humans. I think what we're going to see, I think maybe what we're already seeing, is those tools are going to put out of business some of the smaller companies that do the fairly low level pen testing. The companies that are, they're a managed service provider, but they also started doing penetration testing, which really means they run a tool and they click some buttons. Those companies are going to be replaced. The higher end companies that do the really niche, boutique pen testing, they're not going to be replaced, because at least not in the near future, because there's always going to be that need to really dive into how the technology works and figure out issues with it, right? I think in the middle, what we're starting to see with agentic AI is that people are building tools that can use an LLM to come up with ideas. And then they have other agents that sort of oversee the process, right? So imagine that you've got an LLM that says, hey, let's assess this organization and come up with some ideas of what a pen test should look like. And then another agent feeds that into a third agent that says, okay, here's this issue. Here's how I would fix it. Let me go run that. And so you can spin up lots of different agents to do different lots of tooling. Some of them are focused on, rational reasoning and stuff like that. Some of them are math based. Like you can have different types of agents with different capabilities. And then you have sort of supervisory agents that oversee the whole process. I think that's the future. There's a tool, I don't know if it's public yet. It's called Assail AI. There's an individual named Alyssa Knight with a K, Knight. She has a really neat tool that is effectively that. A huge number of agents all working collaboratively to do testing and pen testing and that sort of thing. I think that stuff is going to replace increasingly more pen testing. I can't see beyond 2 or 3 years what that looks like, though. I think it's all sort of a black ball still.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, there's something from Google which is still in the testing phases. It's called Banana something.
Okay.
Where not the Banana Pro, that one for the videos, but it also does exactly what you're trying to mean, but more of in terms of execution, or maybe if you want to draw something and then there are like 3 or 4 agents. So one is actually doing the work, the other one is acting as a supervisor, something like that, along those lines. And the future is bright. So yes, first of all, thank you, Nathan, for coming on the show. And definitely I've picked a lot when it comes to, 1, seeing how to get a better raise by speaking the right language. 2, which is security hand in hand with the business. How do we do that incorporation? So finally, I would like to ask you to tell our viewers your parting shots and also where can they find you?
Sure, absolutely. So I have one last thing that folks reach out to me all the time, and I always hear this: how do I get started in cybersecurity? And for a long time, I always said, I don't think cybersecurity is an entry-level job. It's really hard to understand risk and understand business. And if you don't know those things, you can have all the book knowledge for cybersecurity, but you're not going to get anywhere. I still believe that to some degree, but I think there are a lot of people that are starting to figure out how to make it. And the one thing I tell people is if you can do anything else, if you can be happy doing any other field, go do it. If you dream about cybersecurity and you go home after your day job and you're focusing on cybersecurity and you're reading things and that just encompasses your world, then you might have a chance to make it. The problem is the cybersecurity field changes constantly, faster than any other industry. If you're a mechanical engineer, the tensile strength of a piece of steel doesn't change over 100 years, right? It stays the same. Maybe our materials get better, but really it doesn't change that much. But in cybersecurity, it may change week to week. Your complete job in 6 months may not be a thing anymore. It may not exist. So it's a challenge. It creates a lot of anxiety, but I think it's something that, we have to do a better job of teaching people how to handle that. I don't want that to sound like a discouragement to people. If they're passionate about cybersecurity and interested, by all means, get involved, reach out to the community, learn as much as you can learn. But I don't know where I was going with that. I guess that's kind of the main point is it's a great industry to be in. There's a lot of potential. Things are getting better. And in some degree, some things are getting worse. But what I really love is the cybersecurity industry is relatively small, right? You're in Uganda. I'm in the middle of the United States, and we're having a conversation about stuff that affects us all. And so, I hope your audience learned something. And if folks want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is unique, so unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of privacy there. I'm the only Nathan Sweaney in the world. But I'd love to chat with people if there's something I can do to help.
Okay. Thank you for coming on the show. And we've definitely picked a lot. And yes, see you all in the next episode.